All right, let's have one more look at the animation applied to our to-do items. So what I want you to pay attention to when I refresh the page is that all these to-do items appear together. Let's have a look. Refresh. See, all the to-do items appear together. One more time. It would be nicer if these items appeared one after another, creating some kind of curtain effect. Let me show you how to implement this. So back to our component, this is where we're querying our to-do items. Now we can wrap this call to the animate child function inside another function called stagger. So I'm going to temporarily cut this and instead call stagger, another helper function in Angular animations. Now as the first argument here, we need to pass a timing. We can pass a number or a string. So let's say 200 milliseconds, or we could pass a string like this. So 200 milliseconds. And as the second argument, I'm going to paste the code that I just cut, the call to the animate child function. So with this code, we're going to have a 200 millisecond delay between animating each to-do item. Let's have a look at the result. So back in the browser, refresh. Did you note that there was a tiny delay between each to-do item? Let me exaggerate this a little bit more. So I'm going to change this to 2 seconds. Now, refresh. All right, here's the first one. Now the second one. And 2 seconds later, the third one. Of course, this is way too much. Somewhere around 200 to 500 milliseconds is the sweet point. And this is the kind of effect you want to apply if you have a page like a photo gallery, like a grid of photos. It would be nice if you render them with a staggering or a curtain-like kind of effect. So I'm going to change this back to 200 milliseconds. Now, I just want to clarify something before finishing this lecture. As the second argument of the stagger, you don't necessarily need to call the animate child function. The reason we are doing this here is because we have defined the animation of this child element somewhere else inside this trigger called to-do animation. If we didn't have this trigger and everything was implemented as part of one trigger, then as the second argument of the stagger function, we would include the steps for the animation. So let me show you how that works. Let's say we didn't have this second trigger. I'm going to delete this animate child. Instead, I'm going to call use animation to reuse one of our existing animations. That is fade-in animation. Now, optionally, we could override the default parameters, just like how we have done it here. Also, if we didn't have a reusable animation, instead of a call to use animation, we would have the actual steps. So here we would have an array with a bunch of calls to the style and animate functions. So let's implement a basic slide left effect. So I'm going to apply the style function with transform and set this to translate X. I'm going to move these elements 20 pixels to the left, and then I'm going to animate them to the right side over, let's say, 1000 milliseconds. So with this new implementation, it's like we don't have this other trigger at all. Everything is implemented as part of one trigger, to-do's animation. And also you can see that in this implementation, we don't have a call to animate child function. Because our children, or in this case, to-do items, they don't have a separate animation trigger. So we don't have a hierarchy of triggers, okay? Now, one last thing we need to change here. Because we're going to delete this trigger in a second, I want to query these elements by CSS selector. So back to our template. Each of our to-do items has this class, list, group, item. So let's query them like this, list, group, item. And then we can totally delete this other trigger. For now, I want to comment it out because we're going to bring it back in a few seconds and you will see why shortly. So save. Now let's go back to our template and remove this add to do animation here. Save. Back in the browser. Refresh. Okay, did you see the curtain-like effect? It was a little bit odd here But let me show you one more time. Refresh. And one more time. So each element moves 20 pixels to the left and then slides to the right over 1 second. One more time. We can make this a little bit nicer by changing the opacity to 0 initially. So it kind of fades and slides into the right. Let's see what it looks like. So back to our component, this is where we have implemented the slide animation for to-do items. Here I'm going to also apply opacity of 0. Now back in the browser, refresh. This is kind of nicer. It doesn't have that flickering effect. However, let me show you a problem with this implementation. If I add a new to-do item here, a new item, there is no animation here. So with this implementation, our to-do items were animated only the first time we loaded the page. Because we animated them here using this query when the container entered the view. In this case, our container enters the view only once, and that's why our to-do items are animated only once. So in a page like this, we really want to have another trigger. Let's bring this back in. Also, another reason for defining this separate trigger is because here we are handling the leave transition. So I'm going to revert back the changes. Here where we are querying our to-do items, I'm going to use a pseudo selector token, that is to-do animation. And I'm not going to implement the animation steps here. Instead, we want to call animate child. And this is purely to prevent these child animations from blocking. And one last change. Back here, I'm going to bring this back in. So let's recap. If you want to implement a curtain-like effect, use the stagger function, give a delay, and then add the steps for animating your elements. This stagger function is designed to be used only inside a query function. So if you're querying the children and there are multiple children, then you can add a delay between animating each child.